Pam Bondi and Karoline Leavitt were peacefully dining at their favorite restaurant when a new employee approached their table. "Excuse me, but you'll have to leave," he stated in a cold tone. A tense silence filled the room. Guests exchanged glances, and the waitstaff froze in place. Pam and Karoline looked at each other. This was the last thing they expected. But what happened next shocked everyone. What happened next made everyone in the restaurant fall silent, and changed someone's life forever. But before we continue, let's find out where you're from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story just for you. The evening at an upscale Florida restaurant promised to be peaceful. Pam Bondi and Karoline Leavitt, accustomed to the noise of the political arena, were finally able to enjoy dinner without prying eyes. They had ordered their favorite dishes, chatting quietly and laughing, when suddenly a young waiter with a tense expression approached their table. "Excuse me, but you'll have to leave," he stated in a cold tone. Pam and Karoline exchanged glances. Silence fell over the room. Guests began to look at each other, and the staff froze in anticipation. Pam slowly placed her fork on the plate. Her eyes narrowed, and the faint smile vanished from her face. Karoline leaned forward, studying the waiter intently. He looked nervous but stood firm, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. "Excuse me, what?" Pam's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You need to leave the establishment," the waiter repeated, less confident now but still firm. Karoline slowly leaned back, crossing her arms. "Why?" Her voice was as cold as ice. The waiter glanced around as if searching for support. But the manager, standing by the bar, didn't move a muscle. The entire restaurant was frozen, watching the scene unfold. Someone pulled out their phone, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Pam looked at Karoline, then back at the waiter. "Let's clarify something. Who exactly told you we have to leave?" The young man swallowed hard. "It's restaurant policy," he said, though even he didn't seem to believe his own words. Karoline glanced at a nearby table where an older man in an expensive suit was watching the scene with great interest. He nodded at them as if offering his silent support. Pam turned her gaze back to the waiter and slowly stood up. "All right, we'll leave. But tell me, what's your name?" The waiter froze. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't back down. "Why do you need my name?" Karoline stood beside Pam. "Because when we return, we'll know who to talk to." A wave of murmurs spread through the restaurant. Some guests looked visibly displeased. Others openly questioned the legitimacy of the decision to remove them. The older man tapped his table, drawing attention. "Young ladies, don't leave. This establishment owes you an explanation." But Pam only offered a slight smile. "We don't argue with those who can't justify their actions. We simply act." The waiter didn't know what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. It felt like he was just following orders, but now he saw this was turning into something much bigger. He hesitated. Karoline took a step closer. "You know you're doing the wrong thing, don't you?" The young man averted his gaze. He had no answer. Pam turned to Karoline. "Shall we?" Karoline nodded. They calmly picked up their bags and headed for the exit, leaving an eerie silence behind them. But just as they reached the door, the waiter's voice rang out again. "Wait!" They stopped, but they didn't turn around. I made a mistake." Pam glanced at Karoline. "Interesting." The waiter no longer looked confident. He slowly approached them. "I was really told to kick you out. But I didn't know who you were." Karoline turned around. "It's not about who we are. It's about the fact that you followed an order without questioning it." He nodded, finally realizing that the situation was far more complicated than he had assumed. Pam smirked. "Don't worry. We'll be back." They pushed open the door and walked out, leaving the restaurant in complete silence. No one was eating anymore. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. As soon as Pam and Karoline crossed the threshold of the restaurant, a murmur spread through the room. The first sounds of outrage rippled from table to table like a wave. "Is this some kind of joke?" someone muttered from a corner of the restaurant. An elderly man in an expensive suit furrowed his brow and tapped his table, drawing the waiter's attention. "Do you even realize who you just threw out?" The waiter swallowed hard. He no longer looked as confident. He shot a quick glance toward the manager, but the man had practically melted into the shadows, unwilling to intervene. I was just following orders," the waiter mumbled, his voice unsteady. A woman at a nearby table, who had been calmly sipping her wine, set down her glass and crossed her arms. "Interesting," she said coolly. "And what exactly were those orders?" "To throw out respected guests without explanation." The restaurant's patrons began speaking louder. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording the incident. "If they got kicked out for no reason, then who's next?" a man in a business suit asked loudly. "Maybe we should leave too, before the waiter decides he doesn't like the way we sit," a woman in an elegant dress added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. One of the older, more experienced waiters finally stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Excuse me," he addressed his younger colleague, "but who exactly gave you the order to remove these women?" A cold shiver ran down the young waiter's spine. He stammered. "I just heard that." "So you don't even know who told you to do this?" An elderly woman at another table raised an eyebrow. At last, the manager realized he couldn't hide any longer. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, remain calm," he mumbled nervously. "This is just a misunderstanding." But the guests weren't buying it. "A misunderstanding?" the elderly man scoffed. "Then bring those women back and apologize." The manager opened his mouth but found no words to say. The young waiter suddenly felt deeply uncomfortable. He looked around at the people watching him. Some gazes were filled with judgment, others with pity. He had never been in a situation like this before. It had seemed like just another instruction to follow, but now it felt like something much bigger. I didn't think it would turn into this," he whispered. Outside, several cars pulled up. A small crowd had begun to gather. Passers-by, noticing the commotion and the people inside recording on their phones, stopped to see what was happening. "Did they just throw someone out?" a voice from the crowd asked. The manager felt the situation slipping further out of his control. He turned to the waiter. "Where are they now?" he asked, clearly scrambling for a way to fix things. But it was too late. Pam and Karoline were gone, yet their presence still lingered in the air. The murmurs in the restaurant didn't fade. People knew, this was only the beginning. Pam and Karoline left the restaurant, but the feeling of injustice lingered. They got into the car and sat in silence for a while, processing what had happened. "We could just forget about this," Pam said, looking in the rearview mirror. Karoline shook her head. "But then nothing will change." The next morning, they decided to meet with lawyers and community leaders to discuss their rights. Their case wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger problem of bias in the service industry. Situations like this happen all the time, but very few people have the courage to fight back, one of the lawyers noted. "Then we need to be the ones to start that fight," Karoline replied confidently. Meanwhile, their story began gaining traction on social media. People shared their own experiences, recounting times they had been treated unfairly in restaurants, stores, and other public places. The restaurant manager, realizing the scale of the situation, called Pam. His voice was shaky. "We want to apologize and invite you back," he said. Pam looked at Karoline and slowly replied. "We'll come back. But not just as customers. Pam and Karoline didn't intend to settle for a simple apology. They prepared a list of issues they wanted to discuss with the restaurant's owners. "We're not just going to accept an apology," Karoline stated. "We're going to ensure real change." They studied the restaurant's service policies, spoke with former employees, and discovered that similar incidents had happened before. It was a systemic failure, and they were determined to fix it. When Pam and Karoline walked back into the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. The waitstaff exchanged uneasy glances, and customers discreetly watched them. The manager greeted them at the entrance, his face pale. "Thank you for coming," he muttered. Pam nodded. "We have a lot to discuss." They sat down at a table with the restaurant's owner and manager. Karoline spread out a stack of documents in front of them. "We reviewed your restaurant's policies and found that there are no clear service standards for handling customers," she said. "Our waiter made a mistake," the owner admitted. "He overstepped his authority." "This isn't just a mistake," Pam countered. "It's a sign that your system is broken." Pam and Karoline proposed that the restaurant implement a training program focused on respectful customer service. "We're willing to help you develop standards that will prevent situations like this in the future," Karoline added. The restaurant owner remained silent for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Let's give it a try." Thanks to Pam and Karoline's efforts, this restaurant became the first in the city to adopt new service standards. Their initiative set an example for other businesses, and soon, the movement spread across the country. The restaurant manager, who once hesitated to intervene, became an advocate for the new service model, encouraging other establishments to follow suit. "We started with one incident," Pam said, reflecting on how far they had come, "and we ended up transforming an entire industry." Karoline smiled. "And this is just the beginning." After the meeting with the restaurant owners, real changes began to take place. The manager gathered the staff to discuss the new standards. The waiters exchanged glances, uncertain of what to expect. "From today, we will work differently," the manager announced. "This restaurant will set an example of what customer service should be." Some employees welcomed the changes enthusiastically, while others remained skeptical. But one thing was clear: the transformation had begun. Pam and Karoline brought in hospitality industry experts to conduct training sessions for the staff. Waiters learned how to interact with different types of customers, avoid bias, and maintain a high level of service. "Your attitude toward a customer determines whether they will return or not," one expert explained to the team. Many employees began to reconsider their approach, realizing that their actions directly affected the restaurant's reputation. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Some felt that the new rules were too strict and that the level of attention required for customers was excessive. "What's next?" "Rolling out a red carpet for every guest," one waiter muttered. The manager gave him a firm look. "If you want to work here, you'll have to adapt." Gradually, the resistance weakened. Employees started noticing that better service led to an increase in customers and, ultimately, higher tips. The first thing regular guests noticed was a shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The staff was more attentive, waiters smiled more often, and service was faster and more efficient. One customer, who had previously experienced rudeness, was pleasantly surprised. "It feels like I walked into a completely different restaurant." Slowly but surely, the restaurant's reputation was being restored. People weren't just coming for the food anymore, they were coming for the service. The story of the restaurant's transformation began to spread. Owners of other establishments started showing interest in this new model. "How did you manage to retrain your staff so quickly?" colleagues asked the manager. He simply replied, "We just started treating every guest with respect." Pam and Karoline realized that the change couldn't stop at one restaurant. They began developing recommendations for the entire industry, working with business leaders and legal experts. "We need universal service standards," Pam declared at a business meeting. "This isn't just about convenience, it's about respect." Karoline nodded. We can't change everyone, but we can create a system that shows how things should be done. Many of the restaurant's employees who had initially resisted the changes were now the ones supporting the new standards the most. The former waiter who had once thrown Pam and Karoline out completed his training and was now teaching new staff members how to treat customers properly. "I made a mistake once," he admitted. "But this lesson taught me that everyone deserves respect." Several months passed. The restaurant became known as one of the best in the city. The changes that had started with a single incident became an example for others. "We didn't just change a restaurant," Pam said, looking over the bustling dining room. "We set a new standard." Karoline smiled. "And this is just the beginning." After the successful reforms in the restaurant, Pam and Karoline realized that their ideas could impact the industry as a whole. Restaurant owners began reaching out to them for advice, and some even asked them to conduct staff training sessions. "We see that your approach works," one restaurant owner said. "How can we implement this in our business?" Pam and Karoline knew their mission was only just beginning. They started developing a training program for restaurant staff, including courses on respectful customer interactions, preventing bias, and the importance of professionalism. "It's not just about politeness," Karoline explained. "It's about principles and values that should be the foundation of any business." They organized their first public event, inviting restaurant owners, managers, and staff. Pam took the stage and began. "The story that started all of this was never about us. It was about a system that allows injustice. We're here to change that." The audience erupted in applause. People understood they were witnessing the beginning of something important. But not everyone was ready for change. Some restaurant owners believed the new standards were unnecessary and that staff should simply do their jobs. "We've been operating this way for years, and customers still come," one of them said. Karoline responded calmly but firmly. "Yes, but imagine how much more successful your business could be if every customer felt truly valued." Gradually, even the most skeptical attendees began to reconsider their stance. Pam and Karoline decided to take their movement to a national level. They started working with major restaurant chains, integrating their standards on a federal scale. "We don't just need to change individual restaurants," Pam said during a meeting with investors. "We need to create a new culture of service." Their efforts soon caught the attention of politicians. Government officials reached out, inviting them to discuss potential legislative changes for the hospitality industry. Karoline held a draft of their proposal in her hands. "If we can implement this at the government level, we won't have to fight bias in every single business. It will become the standard." Within months, their program was already being used in dozens of restaurants across the country. Business owners reported improved service, higher profits, and an increase in loyal customers. The former waiter who once asked Pam and Karoline to leave was now part of their project, training new staff members. "I know what it's like to make a mistake," he said during one of the training sessions. "But I also know that people can change." Pam and Karoline understood that their journey was far from over. They planned to expand beyond the restaurant industry, introducing new service standards to hotels, retail stores, and other businesses. "We started with one restaurant," Pam said, reviewing reports on the growing success of their program, "but now we're changing an entire industry." Karoline smiled. "And we're not stopping." With each passing day, Pam and Karoline's influence on the industry continued to grow. Their initiative expanded beyond the restaurant business, reaching the hospitality sector, retail stores, and even government institutions. Major restaurant chains began implementing their training program, and politicians started considering legislation to regulate customer service standards. "We're not just creating recommendations," Karoline said at a business forum. "We're shaping a new service culture where respect and fairness become the norm." Some of the industry's biggest players resisted these changes, unwilling to invest in staff training. But Pam and Karoline knew that change was inevitable. If customers notice the difference, they'll choose the places where they feel respected, Pam stated. We're not forcing anything, we're simply showing the best way forward. Thanks to their efforts, new service standards began spreading across the country. People who had once faced discrimination and poor treatment now felt empowered, knowing that businesses were finally willing to listen. The waiter who had once thrown Pam and Karoline out was now speaking at conferences, sharing his personal transformation. One action can change a life. The key is realizing your mistake and making the right choice. But Pam and Karoline knew their journey was far from over. They were preparing for the next step, introducing their standards on an international level. Several years had passed since one unjust incident at a restaurant changed the course of events. The service standards developed by Pam and Karoline had now become widely accepted not only in the United States but in many other countries as well. Restaurants, hotels, airlines, and even government institutions had adopted principles based on respect, integrity, and fairness. This new culture of customer service not only improved the quality of interactions but also made society more conscious and aware. Pam and Karoline continued their work, expanding their initiative, participating in international forums, and training new leaders. They understood that change had to be continuous for the system to keep evolving. One day, when they were invited to speak at a major UN conference, Karoline said, "Who would have thought that it all started with just one restaurant?" Pam smiled. Sometimes, the smallest events spark the biggest changes. They knew their journey was only beginning, but one thing was certain, the world would never be the same again.